The morning sun cast long shadows across the front gates of Buckingham Palace, as thousands of tourists gathered for another day of sightseeing in London. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 25-year-old construction worker from Birmingham, who had saved up for months to bring his elderly grandmother to see the palace. She had dreamed of visiting her entire life. Marcus was not your typical tourist. Standing 6 feet tall with calloused hands and work boots that had seen better days, he looked out of place among the well-dressed visitors taking selfies and buying souvenirs. His weathered jeans and faded Manchester United jersey told the story of a man who worked hard for every pound in his pocket, but his bright smile and gentle manner with his grandmother showed a heart full of love and determination. His grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, was 78 years old and had been battling cancer for the past 2 years. The treatments had left her weak and frail, but her spirit remained unbroken. She leaned heavily on her walking stick as Marcus guided her through the crowd, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the magnificent palace that had been featured in so many photographs throughout her lifetime. "Oh, Marcus, love," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter of the crowd. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined. Thank you for bringing me here." Her eyes filled with tears of joy as she gazed up at the imposing facade of the royal residence. Finally seeing in person what she had only dreamed about for decades, Marcus squeezed her arm gently and smiled down at her. "Nothing's too good for you, Nan. You raised me when nobody else would, and you deserve to see everything you've ever wanted to see." His voice carried the deep affection of a grandson who owed everything to the woman beside him. And his determination to make this day perfect for her was evident in every gesture. The crowd around them was typical of any day at Buckingham Palace. Families with excited children, tour groups following guides with colorful umbrellas, and individuals from every corner of the world who had come to witness one of Britain's most famous landmarks. The atmosphere was festive and peaceful, with everyone focused on taking photographs and enjoying their visit to one of London's most popular attractions. Eleanor had been looking forward to this trip for months, ever since her doctor had given her the devastating news that her cancer had returned and spread. The treatments were no longer working, and she had maybe 6 months to live. Instead of wallowing in despair, she had made a bucket list of places she wanted to see. Buckingham Palace was at the very top. Marcus had taken time off work that he could barely afford and spent his savings on the train tickets and hotel room for their weekend in London. For him, money was always tight. His construction job paid the bills, but left little for extras. However, seeing his grandmother's face light up when he surprised her with the trip had made every sacrifice worthwhile as they moved closer to the palace gates. Eleanor's energy began to fade. The excitement and walking had taken more out of her than she had expected, and she was struggling to keep up with the slowly moving crowd. Marcus noticed immediately and found a nearby bench where she could rest while still maintaining a good view of the palace. "Just need to catch my breath for a moment, love," Eleanor said, though both of them knew it was more than just tiredness. The cancer was winning its battle, and even simple activities that she had once taken for granted were becoming increasingly difficult. While Eleanor rested, Marcus watched the changing of the guard ceremony that was taking place near the palace entrance. The precision and pageantry of the ritual fascinated him, and he found himself studying the faces of the guards as they performed their ceremonial duties with military precision. One guard in particular caught Marcus's attention. The young man couldn't have been much older than Marcus himself, standing perfectly still despite the chaos of tourists around him. His red uniform was immaculate, his bearskin hat positioned at exactly the right angle, and his expression remained professionally neutral despite the constant requests from tourists for photographs. Eleanor followed Marcus's gaze and smiled at her grandson's fascination with the guards. "They're quite something, aren't they?" she said softly. "I remember watching them on television during the royal weddings and thinking how proud their families must be. Such dedication to their duty." As they sat watching the ceremony, Eleanor began to feel increasingly unwell. The combination of the early morning train journey, the walking, and the excitement was proving too much for her weakened body. She tried to hide her discomfort from Marcus, knowing how much this trip meant to him and not wanting to ruin their special day together. However, Marcus knew his grandmother better than anyone, and he could see the pain in her eyes despite her attempts to mask it. "Nan, are you all right? You need to go back to the hotel?" he asked, his voice filled with concern as he noticed her growing pale. "I'm fine, love. Just a bit tired," Eleanor insisted, though her grip on her walking stick had tightened and she was clearly struggling. "I don't want to miss anything. This might be my only chance to see all of this." Her words carried a weight that both of them understood. Time was running out, and every moment was precious. The crowd around them continued to swell as more tour groups arrived for the late morning ceremonies. The noise level increased, and the pushing and jostling of eager tourists trying to get better views began to make Eleanor anxious. She had always been uncomfortable in large crowds, and her current frail condition made the situation even more overwhelming. Marcus could see that his grandmother was reaching her limit, but he also understood her desperate desire to experience everything the palace had to offer. This was likely her final adventure, her last chance to see the world beyond the hospital rooms and treatment centers that dominated her life for the past 2 years. A tour guide with a small group of elderly visitors passed by their bench, and Marcus heard him explaining the history of the palace and the significance of the various ceremonies that took place throughout the day. Eleanor listened intently, absorbing every detail as if she were memorizing it for posterity. "Did you know, Marcus," she said with renewed enthusiasm, "that the palace has been the home of British royalty for over 300 years? Just think of all the history that has happened behind those walls." Her passion for learning had always been one of her most endearing qualities, and even in her weakened state, her curiosity remained sharp. As the morning progressed, the situation around them began to change in ways that neither Marcus nor Eleanor could have anticipated. Eleanor's condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected, and the crowds were becoming increasingly dense and difficult to navigate. The perfect day they had planned was about to take a dramatic turn that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about right and wrong, duty and desperation. The situation began to deteriorate rapidly as Eleanor's breathing became labored and her face grew increasingly pale. Marcus watched helplessly as his grandmother struggled to maintain her composure while waves of pain washed over her frail body. The cancer medication she had taken that morning was wearing off, and the next dose wasn't due for several hours. "Marcus, love, I think I need to sit down properly," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing noise of the crowd. The bench they had found earlier was now occupied by other tourists and every available seating area around. The palace grounds was filled with visitors taking breaks from their sightseeing. Marcus looked around desperately for somewhere his grandmother could rest comfortably. But the palace grounds were designed more for viewing than for extended sitting. The few benches that existed were either occupied or surrounded by crowds of people taking photographs, making them unsuitable for someone in Eleanor's condition. The irony of the situation was not lost on Marcus. Here they were, standing outside one of the most luxurious buildings in the world, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured gardens and spacious courtyards. Yet there was nowhere for his dying grandmother to find a moment's peace and comfort. "Let me find someone who can help," Marcus said, his voice tight with worry as he watched Eleanor lean more heavily on her walking stick. He approached several palace security guards, explaining his grandmother's condition and asking if there was a quiet area where she could rest until she felt better. The guards were polite but firm in their responses. The palace grounds had strict access restrictions, and there were no public areas beyond what was already available to tourists. They suggested that Marcus might want to consider taking his grandmother to a nearby cafe or returning to their hotel until she felt better. Marcus understood the rules, but understanding them didn't make the situation any less frustrating. His grandmother had traveled hundreds of miles and spent money she didn't really have for this experience, and her time was running out faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Every moment they spent away from the palace was a moment stolen. From what might be her final adventure, Eleanor overheard the conversations and gently touched Marcus's arm. "It's all right, love. I just need a few more minutes, and then I'll be fine." Her determination was admirable, but Marcus could see that she was barely staying on her feet. Her legs were trembling with the effort of remaining upright, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular as they stood near the palace gates. Eleanor's eyes were drawn to the beautiful gardens visible beyond the fence. The perfectly trimmed lawns, the colorful flower beds, and the peaceful pathways seemed like paradise compared to the crowded chaos of the public viewing areas. She had always loved gardens, and the sight of such beauty just beyond her reach was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "Look at those flowers, Marcus," she said softly, her eyes fixed on a particularly stunning display of roses that bordered one of the walking paths inside the palace grounds. "I bet they smell wonderful. Your grandfather proposed to me in a rose garden, you know? It was the most romantic moment of my life." The memory brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, and Marcus felt his own emotions rising as he watched his grandmother's face light up with the recollection of happier times. She had told him the story of his grandfather's proposal dozens of times over the years, but it never lost its magic for either of them. The crowd around them continued to grow as the day progressed, and the pushing and shoving of eager tourists became more aggressive. Several times, Eleanor was jostled by people trying to get better camera angles, and Marcus had to steady her to prevent her from falling. Her condition was making it increasingly difficult for her to maintain her balance in the midst of the chaos. A group of rowdy teenagers pushed past them, laughing loudly and taking selfies without any consideration for the elderly woman they had nearly knocked over. Marcus felt a surge of anger at their thoughtlessness, but Eleanor simply smiled and patted his arm. "You're just excited, love. Don't let it spoil our day." Her grace and forgiveness in the face of such inconsideration only made Marcus more determined to ensure that her remaining time at the palace was as perfect as possible. He positioned himself as a protective barrier between Eleanor and the worst of the crowd, using his size and construction worker's strength to create a small bubble of space around her. As the morning wore on, Eleanor's pain became increasingly difficult to manage. She had been standing for over an hour, and her medication was completely worn off. The combination of physical discomfort and emotional overwhelm was pushing her to her breaking point, but she refused to give up on her dream of experiencing everything the palace had to offer. Marcus watched his grandmother struggle with growing desperation. This was supposed to be her perfect day, her final adventure, and instead it was turning into an ordeal that was causing her more pain than joy. He felt helpless and frustrated, knowing that just a few yards away there were peaceful gardens where she could rest and recover. But those areas were off-limits to visitors like them. The palace guards continued their ceremonial duties, maintaining their professional composure despite the chaos of the tourist crowds around them. Marcus found himself studying their faces, wondering if any of them had elderly grandmothers, wondering if they would understand what he was going through if he could somehow explain the situation to them. Eleanor noticed Marcus's attention on the guards and followed his gaze. "They're doing their job, love," she said gently. "They have rules to follow, just like everyone else. Can't expect them to make exceptions, no matter how much we might want them to." Her words were wise and understanding, but they didn't change the reality of their situation. Eleanor was running out of strength. The crowds were becoming more overwhelming, and the perfect day Marcus had planned was slipping away despite his best efforts to salvage it. A family with young children nearby was having their own difficulties. With one child crying loudly and another running around uncontrolled, the noise and chaos added to Eleanor's stress, and Marcus could see that she was reaching the end of her ability to cope with the situation. "Maybe we should go back to the hotel for a while," Marcus suggested reluctantly, knowing that this might mean the end of their palace visit, but unable to watch his grandmother suffer any longer. Eleanor looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to see it all, Marcus. I know I'm being silly, but this meant so much to me." Her voice broke with emotion as she realized that her physical limitations were going to prevent her from experiencing everything she had dreamed about. For so long, Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched the woman who had raised him struggle with the reality of her failing body. The unfairness of the situation, that someone so good and loving should have to suffer like this, filled him with an anger and desperation that he had never experienced before. It was at that moment, as he watched his beloved grandmother's dreams slipping away before his eyes, that Marcus began to consider options that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The decision that would change everything came suddenly, born from desperation and love rather than careful planning. Eleanor had just experienced another wave of intense pain, causing her to double over and clutch her walking stick so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Medication she needed was back at their hotel. Marcus knew she wouldn't make it through another hour in these crowded conditions. Looking at the peaceful gardens just beyond the palace fence, Marcus saw what his grandmother needed: a quiet place to rest, beautiful flowers to enjoy, and space away from the chaos of the tourist crowds. The fence that separated them from the sanctuary suddenly seemed less like a legitimate boundary and more like an arbitrary barrier, preventing him from caring for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. "Nan, I'm going to get you somewhere." "You can rest properly," Marcus said, his voice filled with a determination that Eleanor recognized from his childhood. It was the same tone he had used when defending her from neighborhood bullies or when insisting on walking her to the shops. Despite his busy work schedule, "Marcus, what are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, though she could see the answer forming in his eyes. She knew her grandson well enough to recognize when he had made up his mind about something, and the set of his jaw told her that nothing she could say would dissuade him from whatever course of action he was considering. Marcus didn't answer directly, but instead began studying the palace fence with the analytical eye of a construction worker. The ornate ironwork was beautiful, but not particularly high, maybe 7 feet at most. The decorative spikes at the top were meant more for appearance than security, and there were plenty of footholds where the ornamental elements could support someone's weight. The security cameras were visible, of course, and Marcus knew that. Attempting to climb the fence would immediately trigger alarms and bring guards running. But his grandmother was in pain. She was running out of time, and the peaceful gardens beyond that fence represented everything she had dreamed of seeing during what might be her final adventure. "Marcus, you can't be serious," Eleanor whispered. Following his gaze and understanding his intentions, "You'll get in terrible trouble. They'll arrest you. And I couldn't bear that." Her voice carried both concern for his welfare and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, her grandson could find a way to make this impossible dream come true. "Nan, you raised me to do the right thing," Marcus said quietly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the wrong rules." His words echoed conversations they had shared throughout his childhood, when Eleanor had taught him that true morality sometimes meant standing up against authority when that authority was preventing you from helping others. The crowd around them was momentarily distracted by a minor altercation between some tourists and a street vendor, creating a brief window where fewer people were paying attention to their immediate area. Marcus recognized this as the kind of opportunity that might not come again, and his construction worker's instincts kicked in as he quickly assessed the best approach to the fence. Eleanor watched her grandson's face as he made his final decision, and she could see both fear and determination in his eyes. This wasn't a reckless young man looking for adventure or attention. This was a devoted grandson willing to risk everything to give the woman who raised him one final moment of happiness. "You're really going to do this," Eleanor said softly. "Then do it quickly before I lose my nerve and try to stop you." Her words were both permission and blessing, acknowledging that Marcus was about to commit a crime, but understanding that his motivations were pure love and desperation. Marcus moved quickly once his decision was made. He handed Eleanor his wallet and phone, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "I love you. Nan, just watch the gardens and try to enjoy them, no matter what happens next." The actual climb happened faster than anyone could have anticipated. Marcus's construction work had kept him in excellent physical condition, and his experience working on scaffolding and building sites had given him an instinctive understanding of how to scale obstacles efficiently and safely. Within seconds, he was over the fence and standing on the manicured grass of the palace grounds. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Alarms began sounding throughout the palace complex. Security guards started running toward Marcus's position from multiple directions, and tourists in the public area began pointing and shouting as they realized what they were witnessing. Camera. Phones appeared instantly, capturing every moment of the unprecedented scene. Eleanor watched in amazement and terror, Her grandson stood calmly in the middle of the perfect garden she had admired from outside the fence. Instead of running or trying to hide, Marcus simply stood still with his hands raised, making it clear that he posed no threat to anyone and was not attempting to approach the palace building itself. The first guard to reach Marcus was Corporal James Mitchell, a 24-year-old from the Welsh Guards who had been stationed at the palace for just 6 months. James had trained for various security scenarios, but dealing with a calm, non-threatening intruder who made no attempt to resist or escape was not something he had expected to encounter. "Sir, you need to get down on the ground immediately," James commanded. Following his training protocols while trying to assess whether Marcus represented a genuine security threat, the man didn't appear to be carrying any weapons, wasn't making any aggressive moves, and seemed more resigned than dangerous. Marcus complied immediately, lowering himself to the grass while keeping his hands visible and maintaining eye contact. With the guard, "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said calmly. "I just wanted my grandmother to see the gardens. She's dying, and this was her last wish." The sincerity in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and James found himself momentarily uncertain about how to proceed. His training had prepared him for dealing with protesters, terrorists, or mentally unstable individuals, but not for handling someone whose crime appeared to be motivated by love for a dying relative. More guards arrived within moments, surrounding Marcus but maintaining professional distance as they assessed the situation. The lead security officer, Inspector Sarah Williams, took charge of the scene while maintaining radio contact with the palace's central command center. "What's your name, sir?" Inspector Williams asked, her tone professional but not hostile as she studied Marcus's face for signs of deception or mental instability. "Marcus Thompson," he replied honestly. "I'm here with my grandmother, Eleanor. She's 78 and has cancer. She wanted to see the palace gardens, but she's too sick to stand in those crowds anymore, and this was the only way I could think of to help her." As Marcus spoke, several of the guards looked toward the fence where Eleanor was standing, leaning heavily on her walking stick and watching the scene unfold with obvious distress. Even from a distance, it was clear that she was elderly and frail, exactly as Marcus had described. Inspector Williams followed their gaze and saw Eleanor for herself, immediately recognizing that this was not a typical security breach. The elderly woman's obvious physical condition and emotional distress painted a picture that matched Marcus's explanation perfectly. "Sir, regardless of your motivations, you've committed a serious crime by entering restricted royal property," Inspector Williams said, though her tone had softened slightly. "We're going to have to arrest you and turn this matter over to the appropriate authorities." Marcus nodded calmly. "I understand. I knew this would happen when I decided to climb over. I just wanted to give my Nan one last beautiful moment before she dies, even if it means I have to face the consequences." The guards exchanged glances, each of them trying to process the unusual nature of the situation they were dealing with. This was clearly not a typical security threat, but the rules were clear about unauthorized access to palace grounds, regardless of the intruder's motivations. The scene outside the palace fence was becoming increasingly emotional as Eleanor watched her grandson being surrounded by guards in their red uniforms. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she realized that Marcus's act of love was about to result in his arrest, and she began trying to push through the crowd to get closer to the fence. "That's my grandson," Eleanor called out, her frail voice somehow carrying over the noise of the excited crowd. "Please don't hurt him. He's a good boy. He just wanted to help me." Her desperate pleas caught the attention of nearby tourists who began to understand that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple security breach. Corporal Mitchell, who was standing closest to Marcus, found himself moved by the elderly woman's obvious distress. He had joined the military partly because of his own close relationship with his grandmother, and seeing Eleanor's pain created an unexpected emotional connection that complicated his professional duties. "Inspector Williams," James said quietly, "that lady looks like she might collapse. Should we get medical assistance for her?" His concern was genuine, and several other guards nodded in agreement as they watched Eleanor struggling to remain upright while calling out to her grandson. "Inspector." Williams was facing a situation that wasn't covered in any of her training manuals. The standard procedure was clear: arrest the intruder. process him through the criminal justice system, and file the appropriate reports. However, the humanitarian aspect of what she was witnessing was creating complications that made following standard protocol feel inadequate. Marcus, still lying on the grass with his hands visible, was watching his grandmother's distress with obvious anguish. "Please," he said to the guards around him, "I don't care what happens to me, but my Nan needs her medication. She left it back at our hotel and she can't handle much more stress without it." The crowd of tourists was growing larger as word spread that something unusual was happening at the palace. Camera phones were recording every moment, and several people were already posting videos to social media with captions like "Man climbs palace fence for dying grandmother" and "the most emotional palace security incident ever." A family from Ireland who had been standing near Eleanor when the incident began took it upon themselves to try to comfort her. The mother, Margaret O'Connor, put her arm around Eleanor's shoulders and began speaking to her in soothing tones, while her teenage daughter offered Eleanor some water from their bottle. "What your grandson did was very brave," Margaret whispered to Eleanor. "My own father is sick, and I understand why the boy felt he had to do something. Don't you worry now. Those guards look like decent people, and they can see this isn't a normal situation." Margaret's words provided some comfort to Eleanor, but she continued to watch the scene in the palace gardens with growing anxiety. Marcus was being treated professionally by the guards, but she knew that his action had serious legal consequences that could affect the rest of his life. Inspector Williams made a decision that would later be studied in security training programs around the world. Instead of immediately arresting Marcus and removing him from the premises, she chose to take a few extra moments to fully understand the situation before proceeding with standard protocol. "Mr. Thompson," she said, approaching Marcus where he lay on the grass, "I need to understand exactly what you were thinking when you decided to climb that fence. This is royal property with serious security implications, and I need to be certain about your motivations." Marcus looked up at Inspector Williams with complete honesty in his eyes. "My Nan raised me from when I was 5 years old. My parents died in a car accident, and she gave up everything to take care of me. She worked 2 jobs to pay for my school clothes, sat up with me when I was sick, and never once made me feel like I was a burden on her life." His voice remained steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "6 months ago, the doctors told her the cancer is back and it's terminal. She made a list of things she wanted to see before she dies, and this palace was at the top of that list. I spent all my savings to bring her here, and I was watching her suffer in those crowds, getting weaker by the minute." Inspector Williams listened intently, and she could see that several of the other guards were also being affected by Marcus's explanation. These were military personnel who understood duty and sacrifice, and many of them had their own beloved family members who had made similar sacrifices for them. "She just wanted to see the gardens, ma'am," Marcus continued. "Not the palace building, not the royal apartments, just those beautiful flowers that she could see through the fence. I'm a construction worker. I don't make much money, and I knew I couldn't afford to bring her back here again. This was her one chance, and I couldn't bear to watch her dreams die because of some fence." Corporal Mitchell, who had been listening to the conversation, made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including himself. "Inspector Williams, what if we allowed the gentleman's grandmother to see the gardens from just inside the gate area? We could maintain security protocols while still addressing the humanitarian situation." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment as Inspector Williams considered the implications. Allowing civilians into restricted areas of the palace grounds, even under exceptional circumstances, was not something that had ever been done before. However, the unique nature of the situation and the obvious sincerity of Marcus's motivations made the idea worth considering. Eleanor, who had been watching from the fence, suddenly experienced another severe wave of pain. The stress of seeing Marcus arrested, combined with her advancing cancer and the medication wearing off, caused her to cry out and nearly collapse. Margaret O'Connor and several other tourists caught her and helped her to a nearby bench. But it was clear that she was reaching a medical crisis point. "We need to get medical attention for that lady immediately," Inspector Williams said into her radio, "and I need to speak with the duty commander about this situation." This is not a standard security breach, and I believe we need to consider some non-standard responses. Marcus watched his grandmother's distress from his position on the grass and felt his heart breaking. "Please," he said to Inspector Williams, "you can arrest me, prosecute me. Do whatever you need to do to me, but please get my Nan some help. She's all I have in this world, and I can't lose her like this." The raw emotion in his voice affected everyone who heard it. These guards were trained to be professional and maintain emotional distance, but they were also human beings who understood love, family, and the desire to protect the people who mattered most. Inspector Williams made another unprecedented decision. Instead of following standard arrest procedures immediately, she decided to call for medical assistance for Eleanor first. Then consider how to handle the broader situation once the immediate humanitarian crisis was addressed. "Medical Team 2, the front gate area immediately," she radioed. "Elderly female in distress. Possible medical emergency." Then she looked down at Marcus with an expression that was both professional and compassionate. "Mr. Thompson, we're going to take care of your grandmother first. Then we'll sort out the legal implications of what you've done." The crowd of tourists who had been watching the drama unfold began to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a security incident. It was a story about love, sacrifice, and the lengths that people will go to care for their family members. The Palace medical team arrived within minutes of Inspector Williams's call, and their assessment of Eleanor's condition confirmed what everyone had already suspected. She was in significant distress and needed immediate attention. The lead medic, Dr. Patricia Hayes, had over 20 years of experience dealing with medical emergencies and immediately recognized the signs of someone struggling with both physical pain and emotional trauma. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Hayes," she said gently as she knelt beside Eleanor on the bench where the other tourists had helped her sit. "Can you tell me about your pain level right now and when you last took your medication?" Her professional calm helped to steady Eleanor's breathing and reduce some of the panic that had been making her symptoms worse. Eleanor explained about her cancer diagnosis, her current treatment regimen, and the medication that was back at their hotel. Dr. Hayes listened carefully while taking Eleanor's vital signs and assessing her overall condition. The combination of physical exhaustion, medication, withdrawal, and emotional stress had created a perfect storm that was pushing Eleanor's fragile system to its limits. "I have some pain medication that should help bridge the gap until we can get you back to your hotel," Dr. Hayes said, already preparing the appropriate dosage. "But more importantly, you need to rest in a quiet environment away from all this chaos. The stress isn't helping your condition at all." As Dr. Hayes worked with Eleanor, the crowd of tourists continued to grow, but their mood had shifted dramatically. From excitement about witnessing a security incident to genuine concern for the elderly woman and her grandson, many people were sharing stories with each other about their own grandparents and the special bonds that existed between different generations. Inspector Williams, meanwhile, was having an unprecedented conversation with the palace duty commander about how to handle the situation. The legal requirements were clear. Marcus had committed trespassing on royal property, which was a serious offense regardless of his motivations. However, the humanitarian circumstances were unlike anything. In the security manual, "Sir, I've been working palace security for 15 years, Inspector Williams said into her radio, "and I've never encountered a situation quite like this." The gentleman's motivations appeared to be completely genuine, and his grandmother is clearly in medical distress. The crowd of witnesses is growing, and their sympathy is entirely with the family. The duty commander, Major Robert Sterling, was watching the scene unfold through the palace's security camera system. He could see the crowds gathered around Eleanor, the guards maintaining their professional positions around Marcus, and the dozens of cameras recording every moment. This incident was already being shared across social media platforms around the world. "Inspector Williams, what's your assessment of the security threat level?" Major Sterling asked, though he could already see from the cameras that Marcus posed. "No danger to anyone except possibly himself through his willingness to break the law for his grandmother's sake." "Sir, there is no security threat," Inspector Williams replied, without hesitation. Mr. Thompson climbed the fence, made no attempt to approach the palace building, immediately complied with all commands, and has been completely cooperative throughout. His only agenda appears to be helping his terminally ill grandmother see the gardens. Major Sterling found himself facing the kind of decision that would define his career and potentially set precedent for how the palace handled similar situations. In the future, the military in him understood the importance of maintaining security protocols without exception. However, the human being in him was moved by the story unfolding before his eyes. Dr. Hayes had managed to stabilize Eleanor's condition with medication. It was now helping her to understand what had happened with Marcus. "Your grandson loves you very much," she said gently. "He made a very difficult choice because he couldn't bear to see you suffering, and now everyone involved is trying to figure out the best way to handle this situation." Eleanor, feeling clearer now that her pain was under control, looked toward the palace grounds where she could see Marcus still surrounded by guards. "He's always been like this," she said to Dr. Hayes, with a mixture of pride and worry. "Even as a little boy, he would get himself in trouble trying to help other people. I raised him to do the right thing, but I never meant for him to risk his future for me." The conversation between Inspector Williams and Major Sterling continued for several more minutes, with both of them consulting regulations, precedents, and their own consciences as they tried to find a solution that would address both the legal requirements and the humanitarian aspects of the situation. Corporal Mitchell, who was still standing guard near Marcus, found himself increasingly invested in the outcome. "Sir," he said quietly to Marcus, "I need to ask you something. If we had told you from the beginning that climbing that fence would result in a prison sentence, would you still have done it?" Marcus didn't hesitate in his response. "Absolutely. My non has maybe 3 months to live, and I might have 50 years left. If I have to spend some of those years in prison to give her one perfect day, that's a trade I'll make every time." His certainty was both admirable and heartbreaking, demonstrating the depth of his love for Eleanor and his willingness to sacrifice everything for her happiness. The crowd of tourists had organized themselves into an impromptu support network around Eleanor, with people sharing water, food, and words of encouragement while Dr. Hayes continued her medical assessment. Several families had children who were asking their parents to explain what was happening, leading to conversations about love, sacrifice, and doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. A local news crew had arrived and was setting up equipment to cover the story, but they were maintaining a respectful distance and focusing on the human interest aspects rather than treating it as a typical crime story. The reporter, Sarah Chen, had covered hundreds of security incidents over her career, but she had never seen one that generated such universal sympathy for the person who had broken the law. Major Sterling finally reached his decision after consulting with his superiors and reviewing all available options. Major Sterling's decision would be remembered as one of the most compassionate moments in the history of Buckingham Palace security. After consulting with senior officials and considering all aspects of the unprecedented situation, he made a choice that prioritized humanity over strict protocol adherence. "Inspector Williams," Major Sterling's voice came through the radio with unusual warmth. "I want you to escort Mr. Thompson and his grandmother to the East Garden viewing area. They will have 15 minutes under full security supervision to experience what they came here to see. After that, we'll address the legal requirements, but we're going to handle this as a humanitarian exception." Inspector Williams felt a surge of relief and admiration for her commander's decision. In her 15 years of palace security, she had never seen such flexibility in the face of rigid protocols. But she understood that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. The news of Major Sterling's decision spread through the crowd like wildfire, and spontaneous applause erupted from the hundreds of tourists who had been watching the drama unfold. People were crying, hugging strangers, and taking pictures to commemorate what they recognized as an extraordinary moment of human kindness. Dr. Hayes helped Eleanor to her feet and supported her as they made their way to a side gate that was rarely opened for public access. Eleanor was trembling, not from pain or weakness this time, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing her impossible dream about to come true. Marcus was escorted by Corporal Mitchell and 2 other guards. hands still secured, but his treatment respectful and gentle. As they walked toward the garden area, Marcus kept looking back at his grandmother to make sure she was managing the short walk without too much difficulty. The East Garden viewing area was a small section of the palace grounds that offered a perfect view of the rose gardens, the carefully manicured lawns, and the historic trees that had been growing on the property for centuries. It was exactly what Eleanor had imagined when she looked through the fence earlier that day. When Eleanor first stepped onto the palace grounds and saw the gardens up close, she stopped walking and simply stood in amazement. The roses were more beautiful than anything she had ever seen, their colors more vibrant, and their fragrance more intoxicating than she had imagined possible. The peaceful silence, broken only by bird song and the gentle rustling of leaves, was a stark contrast to the chaos of the tourist crowds just beyond the walls. "Oh, Marcus," Eleanor whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "It's like stepping into a fairy tale."
"Thank you, my dear boy."
"Thank you for giving me this moment." Her voice was filled with pure joy and gratitude, making it clear to everyone present that this experience was worth every risk Marcus had taken. Marcus, still under guard, but allowed to stand beside his grandmother, watched her face as she took in every detail of the gardens. Her expression of wonder and happiness made all the potential consequences of his actions seem insignificant. This was why he had climbed that fence, to see exactly this look of pure joy on the face of the woman who had given him everything. Corporal Mitchell found himself deeply moved by the scene unfolding before him. He had joined the military to serve his country and protect important institutions. But witnessing the love between Marcus and Eleanor reminded him that sometimes the most important service involved protecting something much more personal and precious. Inspector Williams maintained her professional duties while allowing the family their precious 15 minutes together in the gardens. She coordinated with the medical team to ensure Eleanor's continued stability and with the security team to document everything properly for the reports that would need to be filed later. Eleanor spent her time in the gardens touching the rose petals, breathing in their fragrance, and memorizing every detail of the peaceful surroundings. She sat on a small bench near the flower beds and asked Marcus to describe what he saw, wanting to capture every aspect of the experience in case her memory began to fail her in the months ahead. "I want to remember this forever," Eleanor said, softly. "Not just the flowers, but this moment when my grandson showed me what real love looks like. You risked everything for me, Marcus, and I'll carry that knowledge with me for whatever time I have left." The 15 minutes passed far too quickly, but Eleanor had gained something precious that no amount of time could diminish. She had seen beauty that surpassed her dreams, experienced love that surpassed her expectations, and witnessed compassion from strangers that restored her faith in human kindness. When their time in the gardens was complete, Major Sterling himself came to meet them. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. But his approach to Eleanor was gentle and respectful. "Mrs. Thompson," Major Sterling said, "I hope your visit to our gardens has been everything you hoped it would be. Your grandson's love for you is evident to everyone here, and while we cannot ignore the legal aspects of what happened today, we wanted to ensure that your dream was fulfilled." Eleanor looked up at Major Sterling with tears in her eyes. "You, sir? What your people have done for us today goes beyond anything I could have hoped for. You've shown us that rules can have hearts, and I'll never forget this kindness." The legal resolution of Marcus's trespassing was handled with the same exceptional consideration that had characterized the entire incident. Instead of formal arrest and prosecution, Marcus was given a formal caution and a small fine that Major Sterling quietly arranged to have waived due to the extraordinary circumstances. The story of Marcus and Eleanor's day at Buckingham Palace spread around the world within hours, shared by the tourists who had witnessed it and picked up by news outlets that recognized its universal appeal. Videos of Eleanor's joy in the gardens and Marcus's willing sacrifice for her happiness were viewed millions of times across social media platforms. 6 weeks later, Eleanor Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family and holding a photograph that Marcus had taken of her in the palace gardens. Her final weeks had been filled with stories about her perfect day at Buckingham Palace, told and retold to anyone who would listen. Marcus received hundreds of letters from around the world from people who had been moved by his story and wanted to share their own experiences of love and sacrifice. Many were from grandchildren who had been inspired to spend more time with their elderly relatives. Recognizing how precious and fleeting those relationships could be, Major Sterling kept the photograph that had been taken of Eleanor in the gardens on his office desk, using it as a reminder that military service sometimes involved defending things that couldn't be measured in terms of security protocols or regulations. The most important victories were sometimes won through compassion rather than force. The incident became part of Buckingham Palace folklore, shared among guards and staff as an example of how exceptional circumstances could bring out the best in everyone involved. It served as a reminder that behind every uniform and every protocol, there were human beings capable of extraordinary kindness when the situation called for it. For Eleanor Thompson, those 15 minutes in the palace gardens represented the fulfillment of a lifetime dream and proof of a grandson's limitless love. For Marcus Thompson, it represented the knowledge that he had given the most important person in his life one perfect, unforgettable moment of joy. And for everyone who witnessed or heard about their story, it served as a reminder that love, properly expressed, can overcome any obstacle and touch any heart.